I'll put them on the ceiling, and then I put them on the ceiling. People want to come in and see the president's office. And so when people come see my office, they see what our business is all about. It's all about people. And I showed the people that I've recognized, and that recognition, most importantly, didn't just stay in my office. It went all around the world because everybody made it a priority.
Welcome to a special remastered edition of the Corporate Competitor Podcast presented by Forbes Books. We're bringing back one of our most popular episodes, this time in a brand new way. Originally released as audio only, this conversation is now available on video for the very first time, giving you a fresh perspective on one of our greatest interviews. This is part of a new series we're calling the Corporate Competitor Classics, where we revisit powerful, timeless leadership lessons from the archives and bring them to life on screen. If you've heard it before, I promise it hits differently when you see the story unfold. And if you're seeing it for the first time, you're in for something special. With me for today's episode is David Novak, the co-founder and former CEO of Yum Brands, the powerhouse behind KFC, Pizza Hut, and Taco Bell. David, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Don. I really look forward to this.
I have to tell you, this has been an interview that we have wanted to do for months. So the idea that it's finally coming to be means more than you know. Your credentials are off the charts. Obviously, we've gone through a lot of those in the intro. But I want to talk about your upbringing because I think it's fascinating to think where you are today, but from where you began. And I read, by the time you were 12, you'd lived in 32 different trailer parks in 23 states.
Yeah, that's true.
There was a Fortune article, and you actually said that moving around so frequently taught you, quote, how to learn, which is a theme in your latest book, and it developed your active learning habits. Can you explain a little of that to us?
Well, when you move as often as I did, and we moved every 3 months, and my mother would check me into a school and say, David, you better make friends because we're leaving. And, so when you go into a new environment like that, that's one of the best ways to learn because you kind of got to get the lay of the land, really assess who the people are, who you maybe could have friends with, be friends with, people maybe you wanted to avoid. And, one of the things I learned, Don, is you're always just one friend away from happiness. And, when I could make that, when I could make that one friendship, the 3 months that I would spend there would be really fun. But until you made that friend, you're kind of left out there hanging. And, it's one of the things that I learned, in business, when someone new would join our company or someone new who would come on the team, I always try to be that first person to go up to them and say, hey, how are you? Welcome. What can I do to help you? If you have any questions, I'm here for you. But I tried to really open myself up so that, I could help other people along. But, I lived in a trailer, and my dad would move every 3 months with the government surveying party, and we'd take our neighborhood with us. We had about 10 to 15 families, and it'd be always a race to the next trailer park to see who could get the best spot.
So all 10 families, 15 families would move together, to the next spot together?
They just, each one of the people that worked for the government would hook up the government truck and to their trailer and then go to the next trailer park. But, I learned also through that, Don, just the power of recognition and support. I played Little League baseball when I was a kid, and I'd go play baseball, and a lot of kids there would be lucky to have maybe one of their parents there. I'd have 5 or 6 of the surveying families out there, all cheering me on and rooting for me, and that kind of recognition and support was also one of the things I tried to carry forward into business, and I think I picked it up very early because I had all kinds of love. People always say, well, how could you possibly succeed in that kind of environment? I always tell everybody I succeeded because of my upbringing. And, and I was also very, very blessed to have incredible parents who really invested in me and cared for me and wanted me to just achieve the American dream. And, being born in the United States, you can do that if you work hard.
You're right. I love that because as I was reading those numbers and thinking about the moving every 3 months, there are a lot of people for whom that would become an excuse, right?
Yeah.
As opposed to a reason. I love the shift in mindset. Where did you get that? I mean, because it would be easy to complain and moan, and I just made a great friend, and now you're moving me again. Where did that shift in mindset come from?
I don't know that it ever was a shift. I think it was just one of the things that I experienced. I just thought this is how people lived. I just was living that way, and other people around me were living that way, and it was just what we did.
Yeah.
So I never really felt like I was.
Isn't that the beauty of childhood?
Yeah,
Right?
you don't know what you don't know. One of the things that I learned later in life, people, growing up in a trailer is not that coveted. You have people, you can be called, trailer trash and all those kinds of things. And that's another thing I learned. There was no trailer trash where I lived. These were great, hardworking people who wanted the best for their family, and so I learned to have a huge disdain for stereotypes, and just and never ever really could buy into that. And I think that was one of the things that made me a big believer in the capability of all people. I always tell people you never know what you're capable of. And I use my background as a real example of that. I would have never thought, or most people would never think that a kid that grows up in a trailer park, doesn't get the MBA, could end up, becoming a CEO and doing all the wonderful things I've had the great privilege of doing. I wouldn't, who would have thunk it? Not many people. But it's one of the things that I try to tell everybody. Don't put limiting beliefs on what you can become.
And don't put limiting beliefs on what others can become.
Absolutely. I always try to look very much at the potential of people. And I think as a leader, as a coach, your job is to help people achieve things that they otherwise would not have been able to achieve without you. And that's kind of how I viewed my role. And, I probably picked that up from my dad. He was a great coach. He was always, I could hit 3 home runs, but he'd talk about how that was good. But David, how'd that one get by you? Or how'd you miss that one play? And he kept me humble and kept me grounded. And at the same time, just as he raised the bar, also did it in a way where I had confidence in what I was capable of as well.
So that was where I wanted to go. As you may or may not know, our podcast is we interview executive leaders who played sports and how being an athlete, being part of a team, growing up in that world actually helped make them better leaders. Mm-hmm. And you've already made several references. But I know your dad, you called him out here, was an important coach in your life, right? Coached you on your little league there. Is there a particular moment, a game, maybe it really was 3 home runs and you let a ball get by you, but is there a moment where something happened in sports that helped maybe shape a little bit about your approach to leadership in business as you would grow?
Well, when I was a kid playing Little League Baseball, my dad was the manager, the coach of the team. And, I remember we were in Kimball, Nebraska, and we lived in all these small towns. I never lived in a big city until my dad finally got what my mom called his first permanent job when he got located in Kansas City. But we were in Kimball, Nebraska, and I was a pitcher. And we had this one guy on the team who was literally there. He had very little athletic talent. But my dad turned him into a catcher. And he'd just sit back there and I would pitch and I'd fire my fastballs in there and almost, knock him down. He'd catch him and but I love the fact that my dad took this athlete who wasn't an athlete and made him a viable part of the team. And he contributed to the team and he did a good job. He was never the best player, But I loved how my dad invested the time in him to coach him and to help him feel like he could really contribute. And he did contribute. And, I think that was a great learning for me is that, is that as a leader, your job is to help people succeed. And, the other thing that I really picked up from that was just the pride that that kid had, that he became a good catcher and that, he was able to perform.
So you went on to become the first person in your family to go to college, and then you grew, held some leadership roles at Pizza Hut, PepsiCo, before co-founding Yum Brands in '97. But and since then, obviously, Yum Brands it's magnificent what it's become. But what was the key strategy? One of the things we'd love to talk about and try to understand more about is cultures, growing cultures. But you took independent cultures, Kentucky Fried Chicken, Pizza Hut, Taco Bell, and you figured out how to put them under one umbrella and yet maintain their own sense of culture. How do you do that? That seems that seems like putting a puzzle together with pieces that don't always match.
Well, the first thing is, Don, we really felt that we should have one culture around the world and in each of our brands. We felt that the brand's differentiations, they should be celebrated, but the way how we work together, the way how we win together, we felt should be the same. So what we had to do was come up with an approach that made sense for each brand. So what we did is we studied our very best restaurant managers, and we studied their work environments that they had that got the very best results. And we came up with what we called our how we work together principles. I never was one to really talk about values. I think values sound very amorphous. When I think of culture, it's like how are you going to work together? What kind of behaviors are you going to recognize and reward and expect? And so we identified the top 8 characteristics that our top restaurant managers had, and we called them our how we work together principles.
Wow.
And then we decided to cascade them around the world. And we just didn't put them up on a wall and laminate them. We actually went out and trained people all around the world about what it meant to believe in all people, what customer focus meant, what accountability meant, what having positive energy meant, what teamwork really meant. And we really trained people with specific exercises where they could discover why this was so important. But the biggest thing that we did that really became revolutionary in our industry, and I think in business, because our company became very recognized for being so great at recognition.
Mm.
It started with my belief that maybe I picked up when I was a kid about the power of recognition.
Mhm.
But I wanted to make recognition the number one behavior that we would execute around the world. And so when I was president of KFC, I gave away these rubber chickens. And then I would go into restaurants and I would number the rubber chicken. I'd write down, when I saw a great performance, like a great original recipe chef, I'd write down, are you the best original recipe chef? The quality is what makes it special. You do it as well as anybody. Thank you for all you do. And then I would give them $100 because you couldn't eat a rubber chicken. I'd take a picture and I'd say, I'm going to send you a framed picture, but more importantly, I'm going to put your picture in my office. And because you're what really makes our business tick. And I started doing this and everybody saw the power of it. And then when you're the leader, I always say you cast a shadow. So once people saw what I was doing, they started doing it as well. The people who work for me and the people who work for them, and they developed their own little individual recognition awards, had fun doing it, and it just took off. And then when I took over Yum Brands, we now had an international company, and people said, "Oh, it's not going to. This recognition won't work in China. Everybody there looks up to brother number one. And in England they take themselves too seriously. They never would really work there." And I had this one guy, Peter Hurl, who worked for me, who had been in the international business. He said, "David, recognition. People are the same everywhere." And so we said, we're going to do recognition.
Amen.
We're going to do recognition all around the world. And guess what? One of my favorite pictures, and in the world are people doing the Yum Cheer in the Great Wall of China, and recognition was loved wherever we did it, and everybody had their individual recognition awards, and we had fun. And recently, a couple of years ago, I went to the 25th anniversary of Yum Brands, and I had everybody come up and tell me that recognition was the number one thing that really held the culture together and was the glue that really made Yum Brands special. And it was an incredible experience. We were written up in Fortune magazine for our recognition. I got all kinds of accolades for doing what I think anybody ought to do. But I really do think recognition is the secret weapon for any leader, because people leave teams and companies for two reasons. Number one, they don't feel appreciated. And number two, they don't get along with their boss, and that's usually because the boss isn't very good at making them feel appreciated.
Right.
So if you're really working hard and you've earned the recognition, you want to be in an environment where people say, "Hey, I'm watching." And so recognition really allowed us to attract the best people and keep the best people. And as you know, Don, if you want to win in any business, you got to have the talent. If you don't have the talent, you don't win. And I think one of the things I'm most proud of is I think I have about close to 30 CEOs that worked at Yum Brands, are working for me or close to me or near me or whatever, I think that when people did move on for different opportunities, I was the first to shake their hands and say, go get them. And we developed a lot of talent, and we were able to backfill that talent with great talent because of the kind of work environment we had. And that's why culture is so important. I don't like the word culture because it's sort of like, it sounds like a germ to me. It's like, to me, what's important is the work environment. What kind of work environment are you creating that make people pumped up and want to come to work and say, hey, I'm a part of something that's really special. I don't like waiting for the employee meeting at the end of the month or the annual sales meeting or where you do the typical recognition. I think you want to build recognition in the way how you do business every day. People always ask me about culture, and how do you really build culture? And I said, well, what behaviors will drive the results of your team? And the engineer just goes, oh, we don't believe in culture. And I said, well, wait, let's back up for a second. What do you want as an engineer? He said, well, I want people to make deadlines. I want people to come up with good designs. I want people to be on budget. I said, well, there's three things right there.
Right
If
there.
you want those things to happen, recognize them every time you see them. And you as a leader, if you do that, you'll get more of it. And that's the way our recognition works. If you recognize things that will drive performance, people will do more of it. And that's one thing that you, as the coach or the leader or the boss or whatever you want to call yourself, I don't like the word boss, but I like coach and leader, then people will get done what you want to have done. And it doesn't matter. You can be in engineering, you could be in supply chain, you could be, in packaged goods. It doesn't matter. You could work at Google, you could work at Apple. It doesn't matter. What are those traits you're looking for?
The other thing I really love about your answer there is that you're talking about handing out a rubber chicken, right?
Mm-hmm.
So sometimes people think recognition has to be grandiose. It has to be a trophy, or it has to be a plaque, or to your point, it doesn't. It just has to be genuine.
And what I liked about the way I did it, and I always tell everybody, make it personal. That's why I numbered each one. That's why I wrote on each one. And, one of the things, Don, I will say unequivocally, I have the greatest office in corporate America, and there's not one piece of artwork on the walls. All it is people that I've recognized all around the world, framed pictures, and people said, David, what happens if you run out of wall space? And I said, I'll put them on the ceiling. And then I put them on the ceiling. And so, people want to come in and see the president's office. And so when people come see my office, they see what our business is all about. It's all about people. And I showed the people that I've recognized. And that recognition, most importantly, didn't just stay in my office. It went all around the world because everybody made it a priority, or almost everybody.
Well, you made that point, right? That when that when you cast a great shadow, others want to follow in it, and that's perfect. But again, it takes a leader to step in and do that. You said something a minute ago that was a question I had. You prefer to call bosses coaches, right? You don't like the word boss. Um, where did that come from, and how did it impact the culture at Yum?
Well, first of all, I think boss is like a 1950s thing. You got to be the smartest person in the room. It's my way or the highway. Do what I
Right,
say. Okay.
right.
That style of management, I don't think ever was really the best. Okay. But it kind of was,
Command and control.
yeah, it was command and control. It's kind of what it was even in the 70s, and I worked my way through that when I was at Pepsi. But, to me, you know, coach is a much better way to think about it because a coach takes the time to really understand you. A coach helps you really drive, self-awareness, makes you aware of what your areas of strength are, what your areas of opportunities are. A coach, lets people know how much they care about them. I think Sam Walton said it, no one will care about you until you care about them. I couldn't agree more. And, when you're a coach, yeah, that's how I think that kind of mindset really goes forward. Now, being a coach doesn't mean that you don't have high standards. I mean, every
Mhm.
great coach has high standards.
Absolutely.
But when there's nothing like having a coach that's raising the bar on you, okay, and at the same time loving on you,
Hmm.
okay, and you know that they care about you and they want you to be the best you can be. When they feel that, you'll go through walls for them, and so I just kind of evolved that into a coach or understanding the coach because I never liked any bosses. I didn't want it. I've seen that boss mindset. That was not the person I wanted to be. And when I became president of KFC, I had to decide in PepsiCo, which is a very red, blue suit, white shirt, red tie culture. I had to decide what kind of president am I going to be. And I decided I was going to be David Novak. And David Novak it doesn't take himself too seriously. David Novak has a lot of fun. David Novak is as competitive as anybody that you've ever seen. David Novak will not tolerate poor performance, but David Novak, recognizes great performance. And when I went to KFC, KFC was in the dumps, and I started giving away these floppy chickens. Now, if we hadn't turned the business around, I think people would have said, God almighty, can you believe that David Novak was giving
What an idiot with those floppy chickens.
he's giving those floppy chickens away while Rome was burning. But we did turn the business around. The reason why we did was I always tell everybody it was a triumph of human spirit. The finance people would tell you that we developed 4 or 5 new products that created all the volume. But what really happened was people who didn't work well together before started working well together when they were recognized and appreciated. And as a result, we got a lot more innovation and we got all the initiatives we needed to really turn the business around, which was something that had not happened in PepsiCo the 9 previous years.
Before we continue, I want to remind you that if one of your 2025 goals is writing a book, but you don't know where to start, I'm here to help. In my new role as publisher at Forbes Books, I'm working alongside a world-class team to guide aspiring authors like you through the process of getting published. Whether it's a story, a big idea, or a project close to your heart, now's the time to make it happen. Just visit forbesbooks.com/Don to get started. So one of the things that I love in that answer is that you weren't changing out people, you were just changing the way they were treated.
Absolutely. When I went to KFC, franchisees hated the company hated the franchisees. I said, look, that isn't working. We got to work together. And the same people really turned the business around. I made a couple of key moves where I took a couple of people out that I didn't think really could make the trip with us, didn't have the talent that you needed to have. But other than that, it was basically the same people. And we had great performance and, became sort of like one of the shining lights in PepsiCo.
Wow, without question. Now, as we mentioned in the introduction, during the 17-year tenure you were CEO, you grew Yum's market cap from 4 billion to 32 billion. But one thing that stood out to me, even more than numbers, was your consistent effort. We talked about this a little bit about this. How do we uplift the people around you as you rose through the corporate ranks? In fact, as CEO, one of the things I read was you led a take people with you class to
Right.
emphasize this principle. Talk me through that idea. Where'd that class come from? You actually taught it at one stage, I'm told.
Oh, I taught it to over 4,000 people. Personally, I made it my number one priority. When I was a part of PepsiCo, Roger Enrico asked me to develop a leadership program for high potential Pepsi executives.
Mm-hmm.
So I put this program together and I called it Taking People With You. And then I was going to give the program to a couple of, to a group of 16 people, PepsiCo executives, and I got this phone call from Roger Enrico and where he told me they were going to PepsiCo was going to spin off the restaurants, Pizza Hut, Taco Bell, and KFC, and make it independent public company.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, well, Roger, I've got this, at the time I was running Pizza Hut and KFC. I said, Roger, I've got this leadership program coming up in a couple of weeks, but everybody I'm going to be teaching it to is it Frito-Lay or Pepsi. I'd like to, focus on learning what a spinoff is and figuring out how we're going to take this company forward. And he said, okay. So I put my program in the desk. So I was fortunate enough to work with this guy named Andy Pearson, who used to work at PepsiCo. He was the head of president of PepsiCo. And then he went to Harvard, was a professor at Harvard. And then he was Clayton Dubilier and Rice, a private equity firm. And he knew everybody. And so when we were spun off, he was going to be chairman, and he said, "Hey, David, how would you like to meet Jack Welch?" And I said, "I'd love that. Are you kidding me?" So I went up to Rainbow Room, New York, and Rockefeller Center, and I have lunch with Jack Welch, and I take my notepad and I'm taking notes the whole time. And I get to the last part of the meal and everything. I said, "Jack, if you were me, what would you focus on as I get ready to go out and create this company and take it public?" And he said, "Well, David," he said, when I became CEO of GE, I immediately started reducing headcount, taking out heads, dramatically changing the company, and nobody knew why. And I quickly got this nickname that I didn't really like too much. And he said, I said, "What was it?" He goes, "Neutron Jack,"
Mm-hmm.
because he was blowing up everything. He said, everybody, I was blowing up everything. People call me Neutron Jack. They didn't know why. I said, if I were you, I would get out and find a way to let people know what you're all about and how you're going to grow the business. And so what I had to do at GE was go back and do that over, when I should have done it at the beginning. So I'm flying home and I'm thinking, how can I do that? And I thought, well, what about this leadership program I developed? So I went back, took it out of my office drawers, dusted it off, tailored it towards the restaurant business. And I gave my first one in 1998, a group of 8 general managers in London. And guess what? Everybody wanted to know who I was, what I was all about, what the kind of culture I wanted to create, what our strategies were, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it was the best thing I possibly could have done. Now, one of the things I did, which was really fundamental, is everybody who came to that meeting had to come in with the single biggest thing that they were working on that would grow our business. Okay. And then my leadership program over those 3 days would give people a process for them to follow to take people with them to get that done, because nothing big ever happens by yourself. You have to take people with you. So I did this, and with these 8 people, I said, boy, that was fantastic. It's everything Jack Welch said it would be. The only problem was that I spent 3 days and I only reached 8 people. So then I decided to scale it, Don. I did 50, 50, and I did it with over 4,000 people by the time I left Yum Brands 17 years later. And my last one was in China, where I did it with 100 Chinese executives. We had a huge business in China.
And you weren't changing the message. Did not matter where you were.
Everywhere. Everywhere was the same message I had. I started out, this is what the mindset of a leader is. This is what you need to do in terms of how you need to have a plan. And this is how you follow through to get results. And everybody walked in with the single biggest thing that they're working on. And they walked out with a plan. And then I had 30-day, 60-day, 6-month follow-up. And people always ask me, how could you spend so much time teaching leadership? Think about everything I learned. I learned about everything that people were working on that they thought was most important. Think about how much impact I had. I helped them develop a plan to get it done. And then think about how I was able to assess the talent. I got to meet everybody. And, the stars would come, they would rise. Okay. And so I knew who they were. And, I was able to give people, bigger responsibilities than what they otherwise might have had, because I was able to see them and learn from them and be able to share with them and have a shared experience that brought us all together. But that was one of the huge things I did to help drive our culture.
But on top of that, this entire concept that you're telling them, I'm taking you with me, and I need you to be taking people with you. You, as you said, the cascading effect of your message is extraordinary.
Yeah, I think that everything has to use the right word, cascade. The most important thing you can do to scale something when you're in a big organization is you have to cascade it. And I would always tell everybody, you skip a level, you pay. You skip a level, you don't speed things up. You slow things down, because you always have to come back and do it again. One of the things that I did, which was a great exercise, which maybe your listeners might be able to do, at the beginning of each meeting, we get around and we form circles, and I would ask everybody to share what leader had the biggest impact on their life and why. And everybody would share it, and then I would say to everybody, now, how would you feel if you had somebody talking about you like this someday?
Boy, I tell you, it doesn't matter who you are, that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up. You talked about a lot of this work in recognition. And one of the stories I read about you had this aha moment in a plant in St. Louis that made you realize how important recognition is. And can you share that story with us and explain why it resonated with people all over?
Yeah, when I was running operations for Pepsi, I was a marketing guy who had no operations experience, and I really had to learn the business from the ground up. So what I try to do is go out and spend a lot of time in the bottling plants and talking to people who knew the business better than me. And so, like at 6 a.m. in the morning, I'd go into the bottling plants and I'd meet with the restaurant meet with the route salesman and ask him what was working, what wasn't working. So I'm in St. Louis one time, and I'm with a group of 10 route salesmen. The route salesmen at Pepsi are everything. They're the ones that drive the trucks and go in and get them, build the relationships with the customers and get the space that's needed to sell a lot of soft drinks. And so I said, hey, guys, I'd like to talk to you about merchandising this morning. What can you tell me about merchandising? What's working? What's not working? And everybody started raving about this guy named Bob. Who, I'm looking straight across at you. You would be like Bob, and they say, hey, oh man, Bob was amazing. I learned more from Bob in the first when he took me out for half a day than I learned my first 3 years at Pepsi. Well, if you want to see how to handle a customer, go out with Bob. He's the best at it. If you want to see how to do point of purchase, oh my gosh, look at this guy. He's incredible. The facings would be perfect. The Pepsi sections would be so great. He knows exactly what to do. And I looked down at the end of the table and I said, Bob, you're crying. And I said, why are you crying? These people are heaping all this praise on you. And he said, well, I've been in this company for 47 years and I'm going to retire in 2 weeks. And I didn't know people felt this way about me. And that hit me in the gut. And that's when that was my aha moment that I was going to make recognition the number one value.
Your latest book, how leaders learn. I mean, what stands out is not only did I love the product. I loved what you shared. I loved what you learned. Three key concepts there. But one thing that stood out to me was, especially as I've interviewed you today, you love finding people and learning something from them. And here you are. You're at the place in your life and your level of achievement where you don't need to go ask more questions about learning and leadership. You've got it. But you did. What makes you so innately curious? What is it that makes you the learner that you are?
When you love something, people always say, "Hey, do what you love." And why do they say that? Oh, it's such a little trite phrase. Well, the reason is if you love something, you can't get enough of it. Okay? You want to be around it all the time. You want to learn everything you possibly can. And that's what made me curious was my love for what I did and my competitive spirit. I wanted to be the best at whatever I did. And the only way you can be the best at whatever you do is to have a constant learning mindset and go to people who know things that you don't know. The only way you can pursue greatness is by constantly learning. I call it's pursuing the unfinished business.
Right.
It's
Because you never really achieve greatness.
the
You're in the
unfinished
pursuit of it.
business. The
Right.
unfinished business is what makes business. It's what makes it's what gets you up every day. I think John Wooden said is what you learn after you think you know it all is what counts. And he's right. Now, why did I go see him? Because I wanted Young Brands to be a dynasty, get dynasty performance year after year. And you know how many national championships he won. And I went to him to talk about dynasty performance, and I got him on tape, video. I shared it with my team. It made it a part of my taking people with you leadership program, and but he taught me a ton, and he's a incredible human being and such an avid learner. I mean, this when he first. Had Lou Alcindor, who became Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. He'd never coached what he called an extra tall person in his life. He didn't call them 7-footers. They were extra tall people. So he went to the Wilt Chamberlain and all these different players who were extra tall and asked them, questions and learned how to coach them, and so that he could be a great coach for Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. And but that's that he had this constant thirst for knowledge, and every leader does. I mean,
The best do. You're right. One of the questions we've asked for almost 4 years in doing this podcast, it's been I think too often the word teams gets overused, especially in corporate world, right? We talk about me and my team, and the truth is what you really have are a group of independent performers who just happen to have the same business card. There are a lot of leaders listening here who are trying to learn how to become team leaders. They're trying to take that disparate group of people and put them together and take them someplace. If you're coaching one of us on how to take a group of people and build a team, what are 2 or 3 things you would tell me I need to focus on first?
Well, first of all, I think you got to get to know your team members. You got to get to know what makes them tick. How they see the business, how they see themselves, what they hope to achieve. I think that's important because when you have that backdrop, it can help you. That's the foundation of everything else that can follow. It's the foundation that helps you bring different people together, find the commonalities. I'm a huge believer in creating shared experiences. So the most important thing I think you can do as a leader is to define reality and create a shared experience that allows you to define that reality together. For example, I would take my team on these best practice visits to talk to the best companies. I'd take my team on bus rides. We would go and do customer competitive visits where we go into stores and see what they did well, what they didn't
The
do.
stores of your competitor. You would like
Our
pull a bus up and everybody
yeah,
walks in and orders.
right, yeah. When McDonald's was outperforming us, I had a global McDonald's day, where we had every team around the world spent, a day in McDonald's, and we codified what they were doing better than us. But these are shared experiences, and then and that help you define reality and where you need to go. So, I think that's something that I would really do if I was trying to build a team, is look for a way to get a shared experience so that you all see the same thing together, see competition together, see your customer reactions together, listen to focus groups together, so that you can harken back to, remember when we did this, remember when that person said this or this person said that. It gets everybody on the same page. So I always try to get, you know, very focused on shared experiences. And then I think the third thing is I would work with the team to define the behaviors that everybody believes are going to be required to get great performance, and write those down and say, okay, this is how we're going to work together. And that would make the work environment and the culture that I was really trying to drive come alive.
I love that. One of the things you're doing now is you're out spreading the wisdom, the lessons, the things that you've learned, not just through your podcast, not just through your book, but also getting a chance to show up at conferences and do some speaking and other things there. One of the things that it stands out to me is that one place that you've done a really great job is talking about how people. Too often we go to events, we listen to a David Novak, we absorb, or we might listen to a podcast. We think, wow, that was 3 really great things, and then you do nothing with them.
Right.
But you do a great job of encouraging people to do something with the wisdom that they've suddenly been graced with. But people are going to leave this podcast today. I'm gonna wrap it up with 3 or 4 things I learned from you. When you're trying to teach people how to put things more actively into play and not just on a shelf, talk me through what you'd tell the people that you're coaching.
What I always say, like if I'm in one of these big meetings that you're talking about, or people come in, I said, how many people back in your piece of Yum, or your piece of Google, or your piece of Apple, or your piece of Wells Fargo, you pick the company, how many wish they were at this meeting? How many wish that they knew what was going on? Well, that they would everybody raises their hand. Of course, they would like to be there. And of course, they'd like to go on. So what are you going to do? Are you going to be a hoarder? Are you going to keep this to yourself? Or are you going to go back and share it with everybody and let people know what you learned, and what the company's looking to do, and the role that you and your team have in terms of really making it happen? So you just can't, if you didn't walk away from here and just say, oh, that's a good meeting, walk away from here with a commitment to do something with what you learn. And that's why in my book, the How Leaders Learn, I talk about, there's a big difference between being an avid learner and an active learner. There are people who can be really book smart and they love to learn things, but they don't do anything with it. You want to be an active learner. You want to take the learning you have and put it to use. It's like Tom Brady could have gone to see Tom House, who's the best throwing coach in the world, and he could have said, that was really interesting. Or he can take notes like he did and go back and work on it diligently so that his passing motion would be more like what Tom House was really, teaching him to do. And, I think he's an active learner. Tom Brady's probably the most active learner I've ever met in my life.
David Novak, you talked about taking that conversation with Jack Welch, taking notes. I took pages and pages of notes today as we were talking. I've written on every scrap of paper I have on my desk because I am riveted by all that I've learned. And I have to thank you today for just being a corporate competitor with us.
Yeah. Well, Don, thank you for what you're doing and how you're helping people and all the books that you've written and the bestsellers that you have. That's not easy to do. It takes a lot of time, effort, and skill to pull that off. And clearly, you're a leader that's constantly learning. And I just think that's a habit that every successful leader has to master. So appreciate the opportunity to be on your show.
Okay, I'm going to share with you, my loyal friends and listeners, that my very first job ever in Indianapolis, Indiana, 15 and a half years old, I became a fry cook at Kentucky Fried Chicken. So I began my career at Kentucky Fried Chicken. Today, I got to interview the CEO of the entire company. Pretty darn awesome, pretty cool. But I want to share with you my four great takeaways from that fantastic conversation. Better than a bucket of chicken, no question. Number one was the power of recognition. When he talked about the recognition is the secret weapon for every leader, but he had a couple of instructions there. Number one, you do it spontaneously. You don't wait for the end of the year review or some artificial setting to recognize somebody. If you see goodness, praise goodness, right? And then secondly, you make it personal. Remember, he talked about those little rubber chickens, and he numbered every chicken that he gave out, and he wrote something on every one about something he learned about that person while watching them. And so, he said, how great is that, right? That if you want, he said that when you do recognition right, what you're really doing, I love this line, is you're actually giving away a piece of your heart to someone else. You know what? And then you really, it just was fantastic. And now, when you want to know what culture looks like, what your organization needs to look like, talk to your employees about the three things they really want to see delivered by everyone in the company. And that quickly becomes what you recognize. Secondly, I love that to become best, he immediately studied the best managers and how they did it, right? So he just said, look, we're going to try to find the habits of the best and learn from them. And then he came up with 8 characteristics, and then he taught them to everyone, right? So you have to study the best to know what the best are doing, and how important is that? And I hope that's why you're listening today. My third big takeaway, and again, this is an extension of recognition, but when he was talking about the story of Bob, right? The guy who was working in St. Louis, and while he's sitting there and asking all these employees about, how do I learn this? And they're all pointing to Bob and saying, Bob is the best. And suddenly looks at Bob, and Bob's crying, right? Well, how powerful was that? Bob had been there 47 years, did not know that people felt as they did until 2 weeks before he retired. And he said, I love David's line, I wanted no more Bobs in my company, right? I wanted people to know they were appreciated when we saw it. And then finally, his entire leadership development program, right? That idea that he developed a emerging leader development program, and then he actually taught it to 4,000 leaders over the course of his time there, and it paid off. As he said, his coaching tree, right? Forget Nick Saban, forget Bill Belichick. David Novak's coaching tree includes 30 CEOs who worked with and for him over his time. And how fantastic is that to be able to look out and see that level of impact? David Novak impacted me today. I will be a better leader because I was in his company. I hope you feel the same. I appreciate you.